So we are rapidly approaching our chapter on algebra. So we've snuck in little bits of things here and there involving algebra. So let's practice algebra using the order of operations. Okay, so for topic 3, again, it's the order of operations just involving some algebra. So we're going to have variable values that we're going to use to replace numbers, or we're going to have numbers to replace variable values is how I should say it. So example 3 says replace all variables with given values and then simplify. So again, we're going to have to use the order of operations. This is not the first time we've done something like this. We're just getting a little extra practice in. I want you to be familiar with variables, x's and y's, so they're not so intimidating when you see them in the next chapter. So for part A, we have -3 times x times y, and we're told that x is -4 and y is 2. So we get -3 times x, which we know is -4, times y, which we know is 2. And now we just want to simplify this. So we're going to use what we've learned about multiplying with positives and negatives. If you'll look here, notice there are 2 negatives. That means those 2 negatives pair up and become positive. So our final result should be positive. So kind of start thinking that. Because we're doing nothing but multiplying, we're just going to work from left to right. So -3 times -4 is positive 12. Positive 12 times 2 is 24. And remember, it was positive 24. All right. So my final answer here would be positive 24. Okay. For part B, we have something that looks like a fraction. No big deal. We're old pros at fractions by now. So I have -2 times x over y. I'm going to rewrite this expression. Where I see an x, I'm going to put a -5. Where I see a y, I'm going to put a -18. So I get -2 times x, which is -5, over y, which is -18. I'm going to go ahead and multiply first to simplify my numerator, and then the division is going to happen last because we're just going to consider this a fraction. So simplify the numerator and denominator, and then simplify the resulting fraction. So in the numerator, I have -2 times -5. When we multiply two negatives, that becomes positive. So this is going to become positive 10 over -18. I want to look to see if I can simplify anything out. Is there some kind of a common factor between 10 and -18? Well, there is. So I could rewrite 10 as 2 times 5. I could rewrite -18 as -1 times 2 times 9. I just want to write that -1 so I don't forget that I have a negative down there. Notice the 2's cancel. And when we say cancel, we get really lazy as mathematicians and we're like, oh, things cancel. Yes and no, they do cancel. But when you're doing something like this, we can say the 2's cancel, but know that that just means they really divide to have a quotient of 1. So I leave these little footprints of 1 behind. So my numerator is now 1 times 5. My denominator is -1 times -1 times 9, or -9. And it doesn't matter really where you put that negative. We could rewrite this as -5 over 9, or we could rewrite this as -5 over 9. Generally speaking, I like to see it written like this, but there are times where it's really helpful to put that negative either in the numerator or the denominator. I like it out front, okay? And just know these all say the same thing, because if you're looking at this example right here, this is like a positive divided by a negative, which is negative. If you're looking at this one right here, this is like a negative divided by a positive, which is still negative. So a lot of times you'll just pull if you have a negative in part of your fraction, you'll just pull it to the front, okay? Next up, we have absolute value. So remember, absolute value is a number's distance from 0. And because we're dealing with distance, distance is always positive. You can have distance to the left or to the right. It's still going to be a positive distance. So what we want to do here is we want to take the negative absolute value of x minus 5. To that, we're going to add a 1. So anywhere I see an x, I'm going to replace it with a 4. Do note that we have a negative in front of the absolute value bar. Inside the absolute value, I have 4 minus 5. And then outside, I have that plus 1. So if you need to do the 4 minus 5 on the side, hopefully you've practiced this and this is getting easier to kind of do mentally, but if you need to write it out, that's fine. We can always convert subtraction to addition. We do that by leaving the first number the same. Instead of subtracting +5, we're going to add -5. And now we're adding two numbers with different signs, so we subtract their absolute values. And then we have to determine, what did we have more of? Did we have more positive or did we have more negative? I have 4 positives, but I had 5 negatives, so I have more negative than positive, so this is -1. So I have the absolute value of -1 plus 1. Let me write that 1 inside a little differently because it's gonna be easy to confuse what's the 1 and what's the absolute value bars. So I'll make the 1 smaller. Now, when you have a negative in front of absolute value bars, it's like its own little factor. It's a factor of -1. Got a lot of ones here. So we got to talk about just the absolute value. So when we're talking about the absolute value of -1, we're asking ourselves, how far is -1 from 0? So if we think of a number line, 0 is right here, -1 is right here. -1 is 1 unit away from 0. It just happens to be to the left, but it's still just 1. So we take that 1 we had right here, we take the 1 we had for the absolute value, and then we add 1. So -1 times 1 is -1. Let me make sure this is separate. So the negative absolute value of -1 is just -1. To that, we want to add 1. Well, -1 plus 1 is just 0. So the final answer here would be 0. All right. Last up, part D, we have negative square root x plus y. So again, we have that -1 in front of the square root, which just becomes its own factor of -1. Okay, underneath the radical symbol, the square root symbol is generically called a radical symbol. We have the x plus the y. We're going to replace x with 16. And, ooh, I have a typo. This is supposed to be a y. I'll fix that typo for you all, but that's supposed to be a y, okay? So we have negative square root x plus y. X is 16, y is 9. So I get negative times 16 plus 9. Well, 16 plus 9 should be what, 25? So we have negative square root of 25, which is really like -1 times the square root of 25. The square root of 25 is one of two identical factors of 25, so that would be 5. So I really get -1 times 5, or -5, and that would be your final answer. Apologies for the typo right there. I'll make sure it's fixed later, but just know that x equals 9 should really be y equals 9. All right, and that's it. So just make sure you practice the order of operations, really practice your signs when it comes to adding and subtracting. It's very different from multiplying and dividing. Make sure you understand those differences, and most importantly, get a lot of practice. This becomes easier and easier the more you practice it.